Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us this morning for this GOPAC Oceania briefing by Transparency International on the Pacific Corruption Barometer. I'd now like to introduce our hosts from Wellington, New Zealand, the chair of GOPAC, Global Organisation of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, New Zealand co-chair, Louisa Wall MP. Louisa.
Inga mana, inga reo, rauranga tirama, ngā whanaunga o Te Moananui a Kiwa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'd like to acknowledge my co-chair, Stuart Smith, who's on the call as well. And thank you very much, John. I think we should begin with a karakia, and I'm sure our Pacific whānau will appreciate setting the scene for what is going to be an interesting discussion. So he timatanga, tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki waho, tuia ki roto, tuia te here tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So it means that we're here to unite from above, from below, from the outside, from within. We're uniting to connect people, to listen, together as one, Oceania, united against corruption. I hope you found that a good introduction to what I think is a very important piece of research. And so firstly, can I acknowledge specifically Lord Fusitua, who is the chair of GOPAC Oceania, and also you, John, in your role as secretary and enabling us to come together. I know we have our UN partners here, Sonia and Marie, looking forward to your contribution, and to colleagues around the Pacific, and special mention of Wendy, who's here from the UK High Commission. Julie, I want to acknowledge your work as the Chief Executive for Transparency International New Zealand, and Marie, I'm very much looking forward again to your presentation. So just to centre us all, what are we here for? Transparency International works actively to promote the highest level of transparency, accountability, integrity, and public participation in government and civil society in New Zealand and the Pacific. I think everyone who's here this afternoon has a passion for and a commitment to the Pacific, and specifically within the context of this inaugural Pacific Island Corruption Barometer, actually listening to the voices of over 6,000 of our citizens. And so this is giving power to those voices. And I look forward to our discussions about how we receive that kōrero from our citizens. And then I guess from my perspective, what we do in terms of our response to this particular barometer. So without further ado, I will hand it to Lord Fusitua. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you very much, Chair. As chairman of and on behalf of GOPAC Oceania, I'm delighted to welcome you all to Transparency International's briefing for GOPAC Oceania parliamentarians on the Pacific Corruption Barometer. I'm of course delighted today to be joined by my GOPAC New Zealand colleagues, the inimitable Louisa Wall MP and Stuart Smith MP, as well as by the Chief Executive Officer for Transparency International New Zealand, TINZ, Ms. Julie Haggie. I would also like to show the great appreciation of GOPAC Oceania to our keynote speaker, Mariam Matthew, the Pacific Regional Advisor at Transparency International. And of course, all of this would not be possible without our great friends at the UN Pacific Regional Anti-Corruption, UNPRAC project, Stonia Stefanovska, the UNDP Anti-Corruption Advisor, and Marie Peggy Courchois, the UNODC Regional Anti-Corruption Advisor, UNPRAC, both of whom are in Fiji. Last but not least, our thanks always have to go to our GOPAC Oceania Secretary, John Hyde, and our Oceania Executive Officer, Katrina Monto. Welcome for helping to put this all together. So GOPAC is the only international network of parliamentarians focused solely since 2002 on combating corruption. GOPAC was indeed formed to encourage parliaments to ratify the UN Convention Against Corruption, or UNCAC. Our GOPAC Oceania chapter was formed in 2013 and covers parliaments from the Pacific Island countries, necessarily including Australia and New Zealand, who are part of our Pacifica family. We are all countries of the Blue Pacific and thus share that familial Pacifica bond. However, we are also all very different, distinct and unique in our own rights. And thus we all face some very similar, but also many different, distinct and unique integrity challenges. Work such as that by Transparency International in surveying 6,000 of our constituents is crucial and invaluable as one of the integrity tools at our disposal in our fight against corruption. It's akin to a physician checking the vital signs of a patient amidst a pandemic. In this instance, the virus is corruption, and this survey serves well to check the pulse, vibrancy, and general health of the integrity priorities currently in our communities. The results, as with most real-life prognoses, are a bit of good news and a bit of bad news. On the one hand, the data you will hear will show you that 1 in 3 people using a public service have had to pay a bribe, and that 1/4 of people have been offered bribes for their votes. On the other hand, the data will also show that nearly 3/4, or 71% of Pacifica, believe ordinary people can make a difference in the fight against corruption, and that nearly 2/3, or 62%, think their governments are doing a good job fighting corruption. Now, these are metrics we can work with. These are figures that show that all is not lost. But the most telling stat is the fact that only 14% think their governments regularly take their views into account. This shows that as decision makers, legislators, and policymakers, it is incumbent upon us to reach out and collaborate with our stakeholder counterparts in NGOs, in CSOs, and in civil society in general, and to take their advice on board as a conduit for the concerns of the person on the ground and on the front lines. I believe these results show a great deal for us to work with, but we must be committed, open-minded, tenacious, and undeterred in the pursuit of tangible, concrete, and measurable integrity progress amidst our wonderful Blue Pacific Ocean continent. I wish you all a productive webinar and I hope you are all keeping safe and out of harm's way, medical or otherwise, wherever you may be.
Malo, thank you very much, Lord Fusatua, for your welcome on behalf of GOPAC Oceania. We've had RSVPs from a number of parliamentarians in the Pacific Islands parliaments, but most of them are sitting today. The Premier and ministers in Niue have indicated they'll join in if possible, and also a number of parliamentarians from Kiribati as well. I'd now like to call on our co-host in Wellington from Transparency International New Zealand, the CEO, Julie Haggie. There's a great partnership between TI and GOPAC in New Zealand with our chapter, which we see as one of the great models. So, Julie.
Thank you very much, John, and Malolile and Bula, kia ora. We're really happy to be partnering up with TI Regional in this exercise. I think the most important thing I would say, and I won't hold it off because the information is the most important part of this, but the thing that I'd really like to say is that this shows what civil society can do in the fight against anti-corruption. So the most valuable contribution that we can make at the moment, as well as advocacy, is to do this kind of research on the ground. And I think that's why we're so happy to be part of this, because we're able to reflect the voices of the people. So I don't want to hold it up any longer, and I think it'd be great to get into the meat of it. Looking forward to that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Julie. And now I'd like to pass to our main presenter, and I'm welcoming from Transparency International, based in Brisbane with the Pacific team, is Mariam Matthew, who's been spearheading the International Pacific Corruption Barometer. Mariam, welcome to this event.
Thank you very much, John. I hope you can see my screen and hear me as well. So yes, thank you once again for the opportunity to present the findings to such an important audience. We've been excited about launching this report for a while, and we're so pleased that finally we have this product with us. And yeah, we really hope that it's going to serve the ongoing anti-corruption reform efforts in the region. So let me start first of all with a little bit about Transparency International itself. We are a global movement of independent national organizations in over 100 countries, and our main focus is to fight corruption. And in the Pacific region, we have chapters, national chapters in PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu. We have a national contact in Fiji. We also have chapters in Australia and New Zealand, and we have a partner in Kiribati of late as of this year. So really excited about that. The work that we do in the region really depends on what makes sense at the national level, and it ranges from community awareness on corruption to tracking elections to make sure it's run with integrity, to last year, some of our chapters were keenly tracking the flow of funds to respond to the COVID crisis. So yeah, it really depends on what's relevant in each country and what's timely to focus on. Now, what's the GCB? Firstly, it is a flagship product for Transparency International. And it is the only, we believe it's the only worldwide public opinion survey on corruption. Previously in the region, in the Pacific, we believe corruption has not been largely studied, and this will be the first of its kind in this sort of scale. We managed, as you said, to capture the voices of over 6,000 people in 10 countries and territories, on their views and experiences of corruption, which is essentially what the survey is. And yes, as I mentioned, we really hope that it's going to serve as a strong evidence base and a powerful tool to inform reform efforts. The 10 countries and territories I mentioned include FSM, the Federated States of Micronesia, Fiji, French Polynesia, Kiribati, New Caledonia, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. The survey itself covered 17 countries and territories. So this is essentially all the members of the Pacific Islands Forum, except for Australia and New Zealand. But this report only covers 10 of those countries and territories. The remaining 7 are smaller populations, and we felt that we needed to dig deeper on to provide more context around the findings. And we will launch a second report covering those 7 countries sometime next year. So do stay tuned for that. The 7 additional countries include Nauru, Palau, Aramai, the Marshalls, Cook Islands, Niue, Tokelau, and Tuvalu. And the questionnaire itself has been divided into 3 broad sections. We assess people's perceptions of corruption, their direct experience of corruption, everyday experience, and their attitudes towards corruption. And we will, when I share the findings in details, we will sort of follow that format. We'll cover those 3 sections. And just to say, this entire project has been funded by the Australian and New Zealand government, so DFAT and MFAT. So what did the Pacific people say onto the findings? We'll start with the people's perceptions. So people believe, firstly, that corruption in government is a big problem, with a regional average of 61% believing so. If you look at this is a breakdown of all the countries and territories we covered. It's particularly high with over 90% in PNG and Solomon Islands, and in contrast, much lower in the French territories. So corruption in government is seen as a big problem. We also asked specifically about individuals within key institutions, and members of parliament score the highest here at 36% of people believing that they are involved in corruption. Second is staff in the heads of government's offices, and third is police. And least, so if you go all the way down the list, are religious leaders seen as least corrupt amongst this list. Then we asked about the trust in institutions, and overall it's looking positive. A majority did say that they trust all the institutions we asked them on. The highest scoring being religious institutions. Once again, you can see a correlation between least corrupt and most trusted in this regard, and probably least so in government, but still a majority think that governments are acting responsibly. So corruption in government is a problem. In addition to that, the prosecution rates are perceived to be quite low as well, with a regional average of 43%, believing that corrupt officials never or rarely face consequences. The highest in French Polynesia and Tonga, with 60% and above, believing so. And in contrast, the country with the least number of people thinking that this was a problem in Vanuatu. So we asked about corruption in government, then we also asked about corruption in business, and here too, it is seen as a big problem with a regional average of 56%, but particularly high once again in PNG and Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands, 90% thought that corruption in business is a big problem. And then in contrast, less so in the French territories once again. We asked, more specific questions around how governments and businesses relate, starting with how businesses obtain government contracts, and 68% here believe that businesses at least occasionally rely on money or connections to obtain these contracts. So it is a problematic area. Once again, Solomon Islands seems to be most problematic, with over 90% of respondents saying that this is an issue, this is a cause for concern. And FSM also quite high there. And then in contrast, least so in New Caledonia and maybe Samoa. Then we asked about oversight of extractives of natural resources. And here too, it seems to be concerning, with 47% believing that there is little control over those who extract natural resources regionally. And if you look at the country breakdown, it's the highest in Kiribati, with the most number of respondents believing that there is minimal oversight of natural resources. Second is actually Fiji, and least so in Samoa and the French territories. More specifically, we asked about people working in the companies that extract resources, and 26% believe that most or all of these people are corrupt. So that's also a concern. Then we asked about whether big interests or big companies influence government decision making, and 40% of the respondents regionally believed so. That big companies do influence government decision making and processes, and it was probably the worst in French Polynesia and Solomon Islands. So this is an area of concern. So that was around the business, government business sort of relations. Next, we asked people about their direct experience. Remember, the previous section was about their perception of corruption in their countries, but now it's about their direct experience with corruption. And here, the first question was on bribery in accessing public services. 32% of those who had contact with a key service did pay a bribe regionally. So yes, we do see problems here. If you look at this map of the region, the darkest spots are amongst the two Micronesian countries that we surveyed, which is FSM and Kiribati, with the highest rate of bribery in accessing public services. and in contrast, least so in Fiji. We asked about bribery in accessing specific services, and the highest bribery rates were towards accessing government documents, second in accessing police services, and in contrast, least so in accessing schools and hospitals, although the rates, the margins between these services are quite less in this regard. We asked about why people pay bribes in accessing these services, and it was not so much because they were asked to pay a bribe, or that they knew that a payment was expected, or that they wanted to express gratitude. The most common reason provided was because they wanted to access a better or quicker service. So that's interesting to note. So bribery rates are problematic, and also the reporting rates of bribery are quite low in the region from the people themselves, with only 13% of those surveyed who said they paid a bribe, saying that they reported it. So that was the bribery questions. Then we asked about the use of personal connections in accessing these services. And here too, we can see that it's a problematic area with 46% regionally saying that they use personal connections at least once. And then around reciprocity, we asked if a powerful person helps them, should they reciprocate through gifts or votes? And 37% regionally said yes. So that is something that also needs to be looked into. Now, looking more closely at voting itself, we asked about bribery to vote a certain way and threats of retaliation if they did not vote a certain way. And there are some problematic stats here too. Regionally, 26% have been offered a bribe to vote a certain way, at least once, and 15% have received a threat of retaliation. And then if you look at the country breakdown, the vote buying rates are highest in FSM and PNG, and in contrast, least so in Tonga and Fiji with under 5%. And just to say, in terms of the most problematic countries on vote threats to vote a certain way are also highest in FSM and PNG, and least so in Fiji, Tonga, New Caledonia, and Samoa. So a similar sort of trend. Then we asked about sexual extortion in exchange for essential services. And this too is a concerning issue, we found, with 38% saying that they have experienced extortion or know someone who has at least once in the past 5 years. And then 42% thinking that it has happened, it happens at least occasionally. And if you look at the country breakdown, it is really alarming in French Polynesia, with over 90% of the respondents saying that they have experienced extortion or know someone who has. Also problematic in New Caledonia and PNG. And then in contrast, less so in Tonga, Samoa, Fiji. So you can see the findings here are quite varied. And yes, we do need to look into this issue a bit further to understand the full picture. And if it is as grave as it is, then yeah, urgent action needs to be taken. So those were the people's direct experiences of corruption. Now we move into their attitudes towards corruption. Here there are some positive findings. One is that overall people believe that governments are doing a good job, with 62% thinking that they're doing well, which is quite interesting to see. So even though they say corruption is a problem, and you know, in specific forms of corruption are also being experienced, on the other hand, they believe governments are doing a good job. In Kiribati, it's the highest, with 83% of respondents saying that governments are doing well. But yeah, overall, it's a majority in all countries, perhaps less so in FSM and Solomon Islands, where 46 and 42%, so it was slightly under majority, believe that that governments are doing a good job. So that's interesting to see. And the other positive finding was that, yes, ordinary people say they believe they can make a difference in fighting corruption. Regionally, 71% said that they can make a difference. high across almost every single country except perhaps New Caledonia, over 80% in Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Vanuatu, as we can see. So really good to see this. So people do believe they can make a difference. However, it doesn't seem like they feel they are frequently included in decision-making though. So while they are interested and believe they can, be part of the solution, I guess more needs to be done to make sure that they are meaningfully engaged. So across the countries, it seems you can see it's quite low. Lowest in French Polynesia and Solomon Islands, and highest in Samoa and PNG, although still it was still quite low. And then lastly, we asked about, specifically given the COVID crisis, we asked about whether they felt governments have been transparent in responding to COVID. And a majority did say yes, that governments have dealt with it in a transparent manner, highest in Vanuatu, Kiribati, and Fiji, and lowest in the French territories. But note that the survey did take place in February and March of this year, and this obviously has not taken into account the new context in some of the countries since then. So those were the findings. As a snapshot, we do have recommendations, but because the findings across regions are quite varied, and yes, the country context also quite varied, we do urge key stakeholders to deliberate on country-specific findings and context and identify specific reforms. But broadly, this is what we had. Firstly, that we've seen that corruption is a problem in the region, and so urgent action needs to be undertaken in responding to it, particularly with the COVID pandemic and climate change increasingly, has been a problem. Ignoring this issue could actually cost lives and threaten livelihoods further. Secondly, we have seen that political decision makers, particularly, are seen as involved in engaging in corrupt acts. So we recommend there to be stronger accountability of them. Third, we've seen some corruption issues between how the public sector and the private sector relate. So these need to be unpacked and responded to as well. Fourth, yes, the people themselves have said that they experience corruption, various forms of corruption in accessing public services, bribery, personal connections, sexual extortion. So these really need to be addressed. We do have specific recommendations in our report, but broadly, these are sort of the areas we're calling for. And then, we looked at voting, and there are some corruption concerns there. So the general recommendation is to ensure that elections are run in a free and fair manner. And then we found out that people believe they can make a difference, but they're not included often. So it's a call to make sure that people are meaningfully included, and hopefully, actually, this report would contribute to that as well, being able to capture and relay the voices of the people themselves. But in order for them to meaningfully engage, we need to ensure that there is right to information, they can access public information, and this requires there to be specific legislation around it. The media needs to be able to act freely in an independent manner. So the framework around it needs to be strengthened in countries, and people need to feel safe to talk about corruption, so that whistleblower protection legislation and mechanisms need to be strengthened in countries too. Those were the recommendations, very high level. In terms of what next, the report can be found online. Top right, there's the link to where it can be found. It's a public document. The raw data also is public, by the way, so do feel free to look at it in further depth. And then the report covers country-specific cards with findings around some of the questions. We look forward to speaking to key audiences such as yourself. If you would like more information, we're very happy to chat further and provide more context and share our plans as well. We've been talking to civil society, trying to explore partnerships, especially in the countries where we don't have a national presence. And it'd be great to get your advice as well to us as we continue engaging with this report. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mariam, for that. That was an excellent overview of the incredible amount of research and responses that are in the report. I'm wondering if there's any immediate responses or comments or questions from any of our attendees. I'll just ask you to raise your hand and unmute yourself if you do have a comment or question. Louisa.
Kia ora, John. Did I beat you, Lord Fusitua? You might have
I
had
hope
your hand
so.
up before me.
No, so it's always ladies first.
Oh, well, thank you so much. There are a lot of issues to unpack within the survey findings, and I guess from my perspective and Stuart's and working with Julie, just wanted to let people know what we've done already, having received this information, and that is to share it with our speaker and ask our speaker to share it with his speaker colleagues across the Pacific, and also to reply to us about his thoughts and ideas in terms of how we can assist with addressing some of the specific issues that have been now presented to us. But I also wanted to particularly speak to the issue of sextortion. I'm also our IPU chair for our New Zealand Parliament, and I sit on the Bureau of Women Parliamentarians. And so I'm particularly interested in the issue of sextortion. So I want to undertake to look at sextortion. Is it criminalised across the Pacific, and how is it criminalised? And I guess start developing a framework about how we can, all of us, respond to these claims of sextortion. And I know she won't mind, but my colleague Anahila Konongata Susuiki is also the New Zealand representative on CWP, Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Pacific. And I know it was her intention, I'm not sure if she's got in touch with you yet, Miriam, but also to share your findings with women parliamentarians across the Pacific, because I do think they also have specific roles. And I think once we start extrapolating theme areas, there'll be different groups that will take responsibility for addressing and possibly advancing specific things. So, kia ora.
Thanks very much for that, Louisa. Lord Fusitua.
Yeah, thank you, John. Just before on my question, what Louisa, excuse me, states is very prescient, especially in Samoa, Tonga and Fiji recently. I was asked a couple of years ago to go on behalf of the Commonwealth Secretariat and aid the Samoan Ombudsman in doing their first national hearing on sex and violence against women and children. And that was a great part of it, sextortion. So with a bit of cross-pollination here, I'm chairman of the Standing Committee on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment for the AFPPD, who John used to work for. So we'd really appreciate that data coming across for a bit of cross-pollination with the AFPPD if possible. As far as the current report, I was just curious about the demographics. If I guess it's available in the report, but just a general impression from you across age, gender, socioeconomic lines. Were there any trends that you noticed? I'd be quite interested in.
Shall I respond to that, John?
Yes, please, Mariam.
Okay. Yes, just on the issue of socioeconomic demographics. So we managed to capture almost half and half in terms of men and women. And that was just a free choice in terms of how do you identify yourself, you know, and then they said, so men or women, they said. And, but we did try and target specific sort of quotas in our survey. using the national census data across these countries. So right from gender to socioeconomic status to various sort of rural, urban, that sort of divide, level of education. We do have that level of breakdown in the raw data. However, in this report, we have not, I have to say, be honest, we have not actually analyzed these specific demographics in further detail to understand what are the trends, what are the patterns. And that would be a next step. There is a lot of potential given that now we've collected this data and we know this kind of disaggregation from the respondents to then be able to identify these sorts of trends.
All right. So maybe even with the very large sort of 3/4 who believe ordinary people can make a difference, 2/3 who think governments are doing a good job, and the 14% who think their voices aren't heard. Those three really core questions, were there any trends across those demographic lines for those three major questions?
We didn't actually analyze the data. It is collected, and it would be interesting to see. Yep. We were actually quite curious about the age, disaggregation, young people versus other sort of groups. That would be interesting to see, and we look forward to doing that. But yeah, right now in this report, it hasn't been broken down yet.
All right, no problem. Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Thanks. Are there any other comments or questions at this stage from anyone? Julie.
Just a bit further on the methodology. I found it really quite interesting because there's quite a good deal of it in the back of the report. Talks about the countries, but any limitations on the gathering of the data, and also a little bit more about those 7 countries and what the 7 other countries that are included in the Pacific Island Forum, and maybe a little bit about that.
Great.
Thanks.
That's good to know. Thank you.
In terms of limitations in gathering the data, usually we try and do face-to-face as well as the use of telephone to reach our respondents. But because of COVID, it has been challenging. We did contract Tebet Research, a company, to do it to sort of collect the data from the region. And across the 17 countries, they managed to only have a face-to-face interaction in 1 country. I think it was Niue. And in terms of everywhere else, it was all via the telephone. But that doesn't stop us now from going back when we are able to travel and continue to enrich this data. Yeah, I forget your other question, Julie.
It was just any other limitations that you had. Like I know, because it was a telephone interview largely, so it depends on people having a telephone. That's sort of one of the obvious limitations, obviously.
Yes, yeah.
And does that have any implications on the data?
Yes, it does, because at the end of the day, it's down to who does have a telephone versus going out to the most remote parts of communities, irrespective of whether there's internet connectivity, that sort of thing. So there could be a slightly higher number of respondents from urban versus rural, and also that socioeconomic, just because of that limitation of purely relying on the telephone to respond.
Thanks, Julie. Stuart, can you unmute? And
yes. Thanks. Thank you very much, John. Well, the important thing about this is it's a baseline, isn't it? And now it gives a good point of reference for how things will change over time. But it would be interesting to have a comparison. I think probably when you've disaggregated some of the groups, to see how it compares to other countries and other locations, because it is an important area to work on. Nobody's perfect, we know that, and we need to know what good looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, given that this is probably the first of its kind that is able to capture people's voices directly of their experience of corruption, As you said, it is a baseline. Anything further we can collect from here would only enrich the data further. And there's a lot of scope to continue to compare and contrast, but at least right now we can compare between the countries, which could help facilitate, sharing of best practices. Samoa has done quite well across some of the questions versus maybe PNG, FSM. So, what are they doing? Is there any cross-learning that can happen? And just to say, from here on, we are going to have, or we're hoping to consolidate, because the GCB is a methodology that's been applied in other parts of the world, other regions. And previously, some of the Pacific countries were covered in the 2013 GCB that was done. This is mainly our chapter countries where we had chapters. But this is the first of its kind that is covering so many countries as it does in the region. And the next step would be now to consolidate the regional findings across the other regions as well. And maybe there we can now compare how the Pacific is doing versus other regions. Already we're starting to see some problematic figures in terms of the highest bribery rates compared to other regions. It's a different context, obviously. Sextortion is also quite high compared to other regions, but that gives us a good sense of how the Pacific is faring as well.
Thanks, Mariam. Any other, Lord Fusatua? You'll have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you, John. Just very quickly, I know this is usually done anyway. As a matter of developing the model, is how explicit is the provision made to make the distinction between cultural practices that would, in a Western setting, explicitly be considered bribery, whereas in some of the Pacific electoral settings, these, without using culture as an excuse to explain away bribery, there are particular situations where the cultural models are such that acknowledgements or gifts would explicitly, under the UNCAC definition, be considered bribery. Is there a provision for some cultural sensitivity in that respect?
We did think about that in the development of the questionnaire itself, which is why we made sure to get the input from first of all, our chapters in the region in the development of the questions to make sure it's relevant to the region. And it's responding to some of these sort of unique contexts, and also experts from the region. So Pacific chapters and experts. And then we did try to translate it as well in almost all the 10 countries that were applied on. So as much as possible, trying to make sure that what we are asking is understood. First, the use of personal.
The word, sorry to disturb you, the word in the vernacular, the indigenous language, which would be able to explain the distinction between bribery and cultural practices, because often there is a word that you can use that that means bribery and not cultural practice. So if it was translated into the local languages, then perhaps that was achieved by that. So yeah. That's great to hear.
Oh, that's good to know. I didn't know that. So almost every, I think 9 of the 10 countries we managed to locally translate, in some countries across multiple languages, to Fiji, I think. So that was good. And then, we are also noting that when we say there are certain percentages in the use of personal connections, given that they're relatively smaller populations and people probably know each other, that needs to be taken into account. But what we're trying to, I guess, say is it should not be used at the cost of somebody who's more vulnerable, losing out. And we're sort of putting this data to the Pacific stakeholders now in countries, in Tonga, Samoa, the countries, to deliberate on, and then based on the national context, understand how problematic is this finding, should we respond to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
just be again, Mariam, could you just talk a little bit more about the other 7 countries? That was the other part of my question about what's when that report on the other, and just about the kind of numbers, you know, because you obviously had some people interviewed there, but you know, and what you're looking forward to having from that data that you've got.
Yeah, so we in these countries, as I mentioned, because they are smaller populations, we still conducted the survey because we hope to be able to at some point speak to all 17 when we engage at the Pacific Islands Forum leaders meetings and CSO processes, to be able to speak across all the member countries as we stand right now. But just for the 7 countries, because they're smaller populations, we want to make sure that the findings that we have coming from these countries are accurate, given the small numbers that we surveyed, and the way to do that is to develop context around it, a desk analysis, to also incorporate other sources of information that could speak to the data, and then accordingly put out what we are absolutely confident on. But still be able to speak to those 7 countries, rather than completely, ignoring the data just because they are small sample sizes in comparison to the other 10.
Thanks. And if people had specific questions that they wanted, so they wanted to have a closer look at the data, could TI help with that? Like if there was a question around age and someone said, well, look, I'd really like to know about, you know, this country and that, would TI be able to provide some of that analysis or not?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is what we want. We want to collaborate with people who are experts in certain fields, in the gender and other dimensions, in other areas, and analyze the data further from a point of view that not only that further sort of scrutinizes the data, but also is enriched by the experience, the programmatic experience that key groups have in these countries. So yes, we would. That's our ideal state, to be able to collaborate with other stakeholders. But also, like I said, the data is available online, all of it, in its raw form. And if this is something that other stakeholders would like to continue digging into, they can also do it on their own if they feel like it's, as long as they sort of reference TI as the original source of the data.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? We're getting close to the final session.
Yeah. No, just thank you, Julie, for that question. That was exactly what I was going to ask, because that's precisely what we need. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I noticed, and it's a good practice that you did discard the other 7 countries. I think Niue there were about 57 responses, and Nauru was also low. And we were involved in developing the leadership code in Nauru, and we actually it was 31 people who went to every family on the island. Obviously, it's a small country, but through telephone, you're just not able to get a response. And of course, in Palau as well, I think that may only have been in English. And certainly what we've found is you've got to have local language to really get 70% of the people in Palau. And that may be also in a number of the other smaller countries. But I think it's really great that you've signposted that those 7 other countries you'll be looking at next year. That's excellent. Okay, I'm not seeing any other raised hands. So moving on from Mariam's presentation, where she did address the issue of the conclusions that were being made and recommendations and next steps, I'd now like to call upon our friends at the UN Pacific Regional Anti-Corruption Project, who have been working in this field since 2013 to get all of the 14 countries signed on to UNCAC, which they are now. So I'd like to call on firstly Dr. Sonia from UNDP at UNPRAC to share her views. Sonia.
Thank you so much, John, Bula Vinaka, everybody. It's a privilege and honor to be part of this forum and this dialogue. I thank GOPAC for the invitation and to all of you for joining forces for us to fight corruption and continue the dialogue on what else can be done in the Pacific and what are some challenges and opportunities for us individually as agencies in our respective roles, but also together how we can complement each other. First of all, sincere congratulations on the production of the first ever Global Corruption Barometer Pacific report. It does definitely is a milestone product. We've been all yearning for data and more information on the status of corruption in the Pacific, including, of course, in relation to perceptions and experiences, because perceptions and experiences matter, and they're also part of the whole analytical approach, and for us to be better able to understand the challenges on all sides, right? One would be, of course, what we would definitely know and follow what is happening on the legislative policy side in terms of the anti-corruption reforms in different countries. There are some common denominators across the countries, but of course there are some specific challenges per country. So in that respect, definitely the opinion of 6,000 people in the Pacific matter, and really gives us a bit of more nuanced understanding as to what people think, what are some challenges and opportunities, what are some gaps, and what else can be done. Of course, understanding and measuring corruption is not easy. It's always a challenging task, and there is no one all-embracing universal method. There is no one metric that would tell us, okay, this is now in numerical numbers, this is how much corrupt is these countries, but it is very, very important that we are really progressing in terms of collection of this information and data, along with the institutional and policy reforms aligned with the UNCAC Convention, and of course our colleagues also from UNODC doing the UNCAC reviews and collecting a lot of the information through the reviews, but also for us working with the different stakeholders, civil society, private sector, academia, all other stakeholders, and we really appreciate that through this survey we have finally managed to get the baseline. I fully agree, and at least now we would know, we would hopefully be able to follow trends and to see how we are progressing, whether the opinions of people change, and how we can contribute further. So definitely a pioneering effort. Congratulations once again to our colleagues from Transparency, and we really look forward to understanding also more the specificities of the data, and also what how we can tailor our interventions based on the specific data and analysis. Perhaps I will just mention that I also see this as important contribution in terms of monitoring progress on international commitments. As we all know, in SDG 16 there are indicators that are specifically dealing with measuring corruption. One is 16.5, which is substantially reduced corruption and bribery in all its forms, and 16.5.1 is proportion of people who at least had at least one contact with a public official who paid a bribe to a public official, and or were asked for a bribe by those public officials during the previous 12 months. And then the second one, 16.5.2, is the same question, but dealing with the business sector. So I think we were, most of us, using anecdotal evidence to see, like, are we progressing? Are we not progressing? What is happening? So I think this is an important kind of indication where we are on this indicator. And of course, in addition, we do have the convention, the ANCAN convention, and in the Pacific, we have the Teyenava vision, which we at the UN also are very keen in supporting. We have been part of the preparation of the vision and its adoption in Kiribati 2020, and then the most recent one endorsement by 18 Pacific leaders in the Pacific. So I think this the findings would also help us hold to account the political leaders who signed on these international commitments. To complement again the other evidence in analysis from different sources, cross-match some of the findings and really boost more positive developments. So I do hope that the findings will be met by great enthusiasm by all stakeholders, including the institutions. I was actually present also in the physical launch in Fiji by Integrity Fiji. It was an excellent presentation, good discussion. It received a very good coverage in the media here in Fiji, and I do hope that it will definitely serve as food for thought, not only in Fiji, but of course across the Pacific. And even those countries that were not covered, I think for us, it's also a proxy indication that can be in a way an indication what is the status in the Pacific, even for those countries that are not specifically covered. It does give a Pacific flavor or Pacific indication on how people feel about corruption. Against this backdrop, I do think that proactive efforts of civil society are very important. Congratulations to Transparency, and I'm sure other civil society organizations, I hope. Then we have parliamentarians, they are very important stakeholders, and I really appreciate that GOPAC is always on the top of the agenda and always trying to unpack and be up to speed with all analysis and developments, and to bring those findings closer to the parliamentarians so that they can do their share in the fight. So great appreciation to the parliamentarians who are really very active in the Pacific through GOPAC, and partner of UNDP and UNODC as ANPRAC for many years now. So really appreciation for that one. Indeed an important building block. I hope we will continue the dialogue. I hope this will lead to further anti-corruption reforms, also more proactive role of civil society. Definitely some questions. I agree with Miriam. I read the report. I was puzzled by some findings. For example, in countries where people thought there was high level of corruption, perceived corruption, and then there was a high trust in the government. And then I was really wondering why is this and how this can be improved. I also thank you, Lord Fusutia. I also was wondering whether some of the answers are related to cultural understanding of corruption, whether indeed what they meant is corruption. So this is something that needs to be further unpacked for us to understand, because the cultural context in the Pacific is always brought into the dialogue when we speak about corruption. There is a fine line for the people in the Pacific between what is a gift-giving culture and whether we are talking about actual bribery. So just for us really to unpack and to understand the nuances, and so that we can just really address more specific issues. Collective action, I really appreciate that this dialogue seems to be like a snowball already in the Pacific. Similar discussions are taking place. I'm very happy to be part of these discussions, and I look forward to our continued cooperation, all of us, to improve the life of the people in the Pacific through fighting corruption. And for us at UNDP, it's always the governance lens, the development lens, and how through fighting corruption we can improve the development outcomes for the people in the Pacific. So thank you so much. Congratulations. Thank you, John, and all the colleagues, and my colleague Marie from our team at ANPRAC. We look forward to working with you in the future as well. Thank you. Over, John.
Thanks.
Sonia.
Thanks very much, Sonia, for those words. I'd now like to call on your colleague in Fiji from UNODC, Marie, for your comments. Marie.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to GOPAC for the invitation to discussion. Bula vinaka. I'm very happy to hear, all this fruitful discussion and insightful, and also trying to unpack all those data. And I'd like to congratulate Transparency International for having conducted this perception survey. It's a massive endeavor, and having captured the voice of 6,000 people is remarkable. It's just remarkable. And as Lord Fusitua indicated at the start, there were good news and bad news in the finding. And that's also where we need to look at it and to understand it from one context or one specific area context. So I think that's also very important, and it's just the beginning of discussion. And this also shows that to develop effective anti-corruption strategy and any anti-corruption work, actually, every institution and the people of the country need precise and detailed information on the nature, drivers, and impact of corruption. And it's great also to see that this will be the start, or you've already started to discuss with other stakeholders. And as Sonia was mentioning during the opening or the launch of the Barometer, you've already started this discussion. And I think one of the things that will be also very important is to empower the national statistic institution, or whatever it is, in which form it is in the countries, to conduct corruption perception survey or experience survey that would address the specificity of the country, but also to measure the implementation of the SDG and to acquire the tools to analyze the data. You're saying that there are some data now that still could be analyzed, and that would be great to have that as well through the national statistic institution, that they are empowered to do that. The result of the discussion today show the importance of all actors, including parliamentarians, to listen to all views, and when there's clear evidence, to act. And by listening to the voice of the people, that apparently, we hear that they are not heard. So it's important, and the parliamentarian will be the best place, and the other institution will be the best place to facilitate the development of an evidence-based policy to prevent and counter corruption. And I hope this finding will be triggering more of this type of discussion. We've heard inclusion of the people and communities is important, and action from that is important. Fighting corruption is a long journey, and certainly not a linear journey. So UNODC and ANPRAC are happy to continue the collaboration and provide assistance in the fight against corruption to government institutions, NGOs, CSOs, media, private sector, university, and the youth. And I must be forgetting some other stakeholders. So I'd like to thank you for this discussion, and it's just the beginning, and we'll be very happy to continue this journey with you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Marie. Thank you for that. All right, Stuart and others have had to go to the chamber. I know they're on no pairs today in New Zealand, and we have reached the end of our time here. I'll just call on Lord Fusitua to give final thanks to our colleagues at Transparency for agreeing to join with us to present this. And of course, the fact that we're recording this means we'll be able to make it available to those MPs that have RSVP'd and wanted to get more information here. Lord Fusitua, for your final farewell.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank Julie very much, Louisa Wall MP, and Stuart for hosting us so graciously. This is a New Zealand hosted meeting, despite being GOPAC and UNODC driven and Transparency International hosted. So thank you, Julie, for your watchful eye over proceedings. Thank you, Louisa and Stuart, for hosting. We really appreciate our keynote speaker, Mariam. Those insights were comprehensive and extremely nuanced. So we look forward to your offer for hosting us to get some further analysis on the data. Thank you so much to Sonia and Marie, of course, our colleagues. Always Bula vinaka to you guys. And of course, John and Katrina for making this all possible. So on behalf of GOPAC, Oceania, we'd like to extend our utmost thanks and our deepest gratitude for your generosity and your graciousness today. Thank you.
Malo, thanks. Thanks very much, everybody. Now, traditionally, we do a group photo, so we'll just see if we can do, yes, we can get everybody there for just a final photograph for our records. And I do thank my colleagues in GOPAC in Doha as well for joining with us. So Malo, Talaufa, Bulavanaka, Ali, thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, John.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Good to see you.
Ka kite anō.
Yeah.
Bye.
thank you.